So to start us off, I wonder if you would just read a little bit from this amazing, amazing book.
I am just going to launch in. And you're just going to have to bear with me. I don't speak French, so no one tell my teacher from middle school this pronunciation that's about to happen. The French have an old saying, entre chien et loup, which refers to that dawn or dusk hour when it becomes hard to tell the difference between a dog and a wolf. That time when you cannot tell if the shadow on the road before you is familiar or strange, if it poses a threat. With roots in the Latin expression inter canem e lupum, that time when the dog sleeps and the wolf seeks his prey, as a 17th century English treatise described it, the phrase connotes a threshold between the known and the unknown, that liminal zone where anxieties may be rational or unfounded. In the moment of entre chien et loup, it seems to me, the journey is as internal as it is external. What you see on the path is shaped not only by your eyes, but also by your mind, stories you have inherited, experiences you have accumulated, beliefs you carry about how the world will treat you. I began to suspect I would not see the wolf, never mind the things it conjured within us, without first zooming in on this moment of identification. Every day we trace the contours of fear in our own lives, squinting for its shapes, listening for its creaks, evaluating if our hearts are right to pound. This is the tipping point where one creature might be tagged as predator and one as prey. It is the moment our eyes might first get it wrong. Initially, I believed I would be a good arbiter of entre chien et loup. Surely I could tell a dog from a wolf. I'm mildly nearsighted, but neurotic about detail, rational, or at least attuned to the prospect of my irrationality. At the time, I was encountering stories about wolves, both real and imagined, with the cool, smug distance of a reader who could flip to the ending and turn away. But as I continued my research, driving into the mountains, sharpening pencils in little spears to take into the archives, I began to see that even if the stories I had heard about wolves were collected in the pages of folk tales and old newspapers, their undercurrents were enacted in the pages of our lives. I wanted to consider the theater of predator and prey from the remove of my laptop screen. Life got in the way. A few weeks into my first semester, I left the college library around 11 p.m. to walk to my dorm. The quad of the Snow Globe campus was quiet. The air smelled like pine trees and old rain, and my mind was full of Robert Haas, the California poet whose words I'd been introduced to in class that week. His poems were full of droopy trees and fog-soaked mornings, and I was surprised how swiftly my longing for Oregon had gotten caught between his words, gathering like lint in a comb. The nostalgia flustered me, revealing a homesickness I had so far kept tamped down in New England. That was what I was thinking as I kicked my sneakers through the moonlit grass, how sorely I wanted a sign I belonged here in a dining hall of lacrosse sticks and pastel shorts embroidered with tiny lobsters. A place where people referred to this city and only meant one place, New York, even though many took planes to arrive, passing over other cities as they went. As I rounded the curve of a shadowy path about 200 yards from my front door, I saw a pack of guys walking toward me through the trees. I do not know whether to call them men or boys. I could not tell if they were talking, but they had the straight gait of people who were not engaged in conversation, but purpose. Their bodies were muscular, solid as a wall of trees. "We are what we can imagine," wrote Haas in the poem Winged and Acid Dark. Some spark plug in the root of my spine told me to panic, but I was what my parents called jumpy, and I was trying to learn to control it. Besides, this was a small town of students and retirees on the coast. I was used to seeing others returning from the library at this hour, and I imagined the group would murmur hello as we slouched past each other. They did not. When we were a few feet apart, the line of guys formed a tight semicircle around me. They did not speak, but they stared, and when I looked back, I saw that their faces were masked in white cotton t-shirts with slits for eyes and mouth. The white athletic socks they wore on their hands turned their fingers into paws. I do not need to tell you what my heart did in those moments or for the rest of the night or for the nights that followed. What happened to my body is that it froze, and the men were frozen too. It was a terrible dance. The moon gaped above us. Pray, I thought, with an A. Also pray, with an E. Nobody talked. I waited for their hands to reach for me. They did not. Finally, my body pushed through their bodies and ran. Nobody followed. Within minutes of arriving back at my dorm, I called campus security and reported the masked men. The next day, an officer called me to confirm their identity on camera footage. Their headquarters was behind the little white house where I just attended my first student newspaper meeting, and I kept my head low as I walked, trying not to feel like a snitch. I didn't know if the masked men were a legitimate threat, but I trusted security would solve the problem. Now, sitting on the edge of a plastic office chair, I watched a stream of silent video that showed the men keying into one of the dorms, jostling one another in the foyer like herded cows. That's them, I said. The officer, one I didn't know, ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. Creepy as heck with their faces and hands covered like that. I nodded. What else was there to say? These were the faces I would think of years later when I read about ancient warrior men who, when masqueraded as animals, did things they would never do as men. The officer told me these were first-year soccer players who'd been initiated. That's code for drunk. Hazed. Security staff had already spoken with the guys. They were very sorry about their inebriated prank. They meant no harm, he said. That did not make me feel safer, but it did make me feel foolish, like I should have been in on the joke. When he mentioned some names, I recognized one as someone who sat behind me in microeconomics, a guy who'd already smiled and retrieved a pencil I dropped on the floor. He wore the sweatshirt of his boarding school and had the blunt, forgettable attractiveness of a Ken doll. Then the officer told me the soccer players did not know whom they had scared, but they wanted to apologize face to face. I thought about it. I wanted to see how the men wore sorry on their lips. But some shard of my teenage self did not want to interfere with the equilibrium of that afternoon economics class or anything else. I said I didn't need a personal apology. On one level, it seemed only fair. They had had their masks, and now I could have mine. I wanted to let them think that I could be any woman on campus, that I could be anywhere watching them, that at any moment I might step toward them, collapse the space, and open my mouth. Mostly, though, I did not want to be known for tattletale fear. At some point after leaving security, I got a call from a campus dean who apologized for what had happened and mandated that I see a campus mental health counselor. I began to wonder if, in the college's eyes, it was I and not the boys who needed fixing. Later that day, I called my mother. We were close, so I told her almost everything, but with a country of new distance between us, I wanted to frame things in a way that wouldn't worry her. I mentioned what had happened with the soccer players, but I spent more time making an anecdote of my visit to security headquarters, with its burnt coffee smell and its wall of little screens. "I'm so sorry that happened," she said. We both knew that what this really meant was, "I wish I could protect you from everything." We were silent for a second, then I said, "It's okay," which we both knew meant, "I know you can't." Evenings were different after that night. Even once I learned the group had meant no harm, I called the campus shuttle to ride a few blocks, or I left the library when a friend left, or I did homework in my dorm. Logically, I understood that nothing about the state of campus safety had changed. The only thing that had changed was my capacity to understand life at the brink of terror. That, it seems, was enough. It was a waiting room I dreaded returning to. Every day, men did far worse things than the soccer players had done that night, and I had been for so many years, luckier than many. But that night on the quad was the first brick to smash the glass, shattering the window between my lived experiences and my anxieties of what the world could be. It was the first time I accepted that the stranger coming toward me down the street might not just nod or ignore me, that he might be wearing a mask when he blocked my path. It was, in this way, a night for growing up. I cannot remember what happened to the soccer players or if they received any punishment, and I'm not sure what the charges would have been because I'm not sure how to narrate that night. The word victim has its roots in the Latin victima, meaning sacrificial animal. Could I be a victim if the boys had not meant harm? I did not feel like one, not exactly. I felt like a girl who'd left home and learned a lesson. I had this in common with the boys. They who had just left home too, they who, like me, were learning their thresholds, what we could get away with, what might break us. As the months passed, I wondered if that night stood out for them at all. In the college's eyes, they were just sheep in wolves' clothing. Thank you.
Erica, thank you so much. Congratulations on the publication of this incredible book. And this is the result of so much work, about a decade's worth of work. And as you so deftly illustrate with that anecdote, the story of fear is really hard to tell. And the book is about wolves, but it's also about fear. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where it began and how those two themes came together for you.
Yeah. I think now I can see that my interest in real and symbolic wolves blossomed somewhat simultaneously. I was a college student. I was in my early 20s in Maine, and wolves were coming back to Oregon, my home state. And at that time, I didn't understand that that was controversial. As some of you may or may not know, I have family in Montana and a grandfather who has a sheep farm. And so I grew up understanding the sort of visceral feeling of protection you feel towards, say, a lamb that's been attacked by a coyote. So I could understand that. But then I have an uncle in Montana who's a taxidermist. And one day I saw his pickup truck had a lot of anti-wolf bumper stickers that are quite good, like smoke a pack a day, killing wolves, wolves, the other red meat, wolves, government-sponsored terrorism, and I did not understand it. There seemed like there was this leap between the rhetoric and the reality, and so I started trying to think about them, and I thought, I'm going to study them academically. I'm going to go in and just do my little interviews and figure out the science, and everyone will get along. And I was very naive. I was 20 years old. You have to be that way. And then my mother got really sick one summer, and she was in the hospital, and her fever was really, really high, and I was supposed to go lead a canoeing trip. I was going out of service, and I was so worried, and nobody could figure it out. And at one point, my dad calls, and he's like, good news, we figured out what it is. It's a tick illness. And somebody in the hospital room, in the way that these people, you make conversation, and someone had said, well, if we only had more wolves, the deer and the rodents wouldn't be so out of, the ecosystem is out of whack, and more people, we're seeing all these people getting sick from ticks in Oregon. And I'd never thought of the fact that a wolf and my body were connected on some sort of ecosystem web, and it felt quite profound. And later, thinking about Little Red Riding Hood, I would think about the ways that that's a story about people trying to protect each other and not knowing how in some way. And there was a way that my mother had gone into the forest, and she'd gotten sick in a cabin, and she'd been bit by something in the forest, and she'd fallen into bed, and I was worried about her. And it was the same story, but the wolf in this form was a different thing. There was more of a solution. So that's sort of my entry into the research. But then I think around this time, as I sort of, in the excerpt I read, I was having experiences leaving home for the first time and trying to live in my body and trying to understand what it meant to be doing research and sometimes come up against things that scared me, right? And sometimes that was very early when I got to graduate school in Minneapolis. I thought, I'm just going to sit here and research wolves, and I was grabbed on a sidewalk in Northeast, leaving a brewery by someone I didn't know, and there was a bystander who intervened, and I was not seriously injured really at all, but psychically it was huge, and it was very hard for me to know how to walk down the street, and I just felt like I was obsessed with how other people seemed to be doing a better job of living beside their fear than I was. And I would think, well, I'm just going to go on this reporting trip and report on wolves. And then I would have an experience on the trip that suddenly I felt like fear was this smear of grease on my glasses that I couldn't clean off. And I felt like I so often in Western stories about the wolf that I'd inherited, the wolf becomes this vessel for fears. And I thought, I don't just want to like empty that vessel out. I want to think like, if we're not using the wolf as the big bad thing, like what does it mean that we've carried those stories, and how else can we protect each other if we're not telling stories about the big bad wolf? Or how do we think about fear and the ways it's used? And so, very long-winded answer, but very long research process. So.
And an answer so full of the kind of good metaphors that the book is also full of. I'm like, I was cleaning grease off my glasses just 5 minutes before this event.
It's a perennial metaphor in my
But
life.
yeah, I do feel like, the astuteness of your metaphors is one of the very many pleasures of the book. You have referred to your long research process, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, because it does seem like, I don't know, at least for me, like the danger is that the research can sprawl, and I can get lost in it and never come out, and it could go in so many directions. How did you decide which directions to go in and which paths to follow?
I mean, that's very kind that you are not acknowledging that is what, this is a very sprawling book, to be clear. Like, it's very, I think the title, Wolfish, which I sort of think about ideas of hunger, and this idea of like, the sort of stereotypical wolf is like this hungry, greedy, too much thing. And I think that was my approach to research, was like being this extremely omnivorous self. And, I think to some degree I was writing a book about wolves that I wanted to read, which is to say I'm the sort of reader that will read a book of poetry that maybe has some wolf poems, and I'm reading a book of biology, and I'm reading history, and I'm reading a novel, and all those pages are open on my desk. And I wanted to write a book that would have them in conversation together in the way that they were in my mind. And I think, especially with wolves, if I say wolf, wow, I haven't done this as like an audience thing, but like, what do you think of right away when you hear wolf? Sorry, totally put you on the spot randomly.
Probably Little Red Riding Hood. That's
Okay, yeah, Little Red Riding Hood. What about you?
Family.
A family. I mean, I think this is exactly it. Like, the word wolf is going to maybe conjure someone you saw in a zoo. It's going to conjure going to Yellowstone. It's going to conjure a lone wolf shooter headline. And it's an animal that's so familiar in our psyches that I wanted to try to chase that association on the page. And I think a lot of my research process would be me going, okay, I'm going to say search in the New York Times archive for every story that mentions wolf. And what I'm going to realize is that a lot of those are not about real wolves. And then sometimes it was just like running into things. Like one night in grad school, I was like, I should be researching wolves, but I'm going to go to a movie at the Walker. There's a documentary playing, and I should take the night off from research. You just like can't do that sometimes, because while I was there watching a movie about the militarization of the police, there was an anecdote about the sheepdog seminars, which were these trainings for officers that basically posit that people are either sheep, who are the public who need protecting, wolves, innately violent, or sheepdogs who need to protect the sheep. And this was a clear example of the ways that so much rhetoric around the wolf is animalizing people in harmful ways and also vilifying animals in harmful ways. And I was like sitting under the table taking notes, being like, I've got to write about this now. So a lot of the research was just like being open to whatever was kind of hitting the dashboard as I was just like driving down life, and like seeing a wolf on the side of the RV and thinking about what that conjures about freedom and masculinity on the open road, because wolves are everywhere.
They really are. And your book is sprawling, but in a delightful way, and it's also organized in a really interesting way. So it has different sections, adventure, girl, town, truth, country, self, and mother, and then all of those versus wolf. So I wonder how you arrived at that structure and the versus part of it, and kind of what the idea of opposition has to do with fear, because also so much of your book is about how we think about ourselves and how we are generating our own fears. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about what you think, fear has to do with responsibility, because that is sort of also in interesting ways kind of implied by that structure.
Yeah, that's such a smart question that I'll be thinking about at like 2 a.m. this morning, so thank you. I think, so my original thought was understanding that in this sort of biblical Western dominant tradition of the wolf that I'd certainly inherited, and it's the most sort of powerful connotation in America, the wolf is the other traditionally, and it's also a representation of like the evil. I mean, Hitchcock has a quote that is, gosh, you'd think I would remember this. I've misquoted this now a couple times. Something about, we're afraid of the same thing we were yesterday, it's just a different wolf. And that idea that the wolf is just like the opposition and the antagonist. So that idea, I wanted to break that idea down and show that like wolves just don't care about us. We're not existing. I use the metaphor of like, it's not a boxing ring, it's more of like a dance floor, and we're all bumping into each other. And that's our relationship with wolves. They just are afraid of us, and they do not know that we are so fixated on them. It's creepy, it's weird. And so I think thinking about this versus idea as a way to sort of like highlight an antagonism and a binary that's very false. So that became a way to talk about the idea of girl versus wolf. Well, wolves are also, what about a young female wolf? And like sort of getting in between those different ideas. And so the book expands outward. I would say it starts pretty intimately with my own life and then gets a little bit more conceptual. It's talked about nation states and ideas of the self and ideas of the self being a predator and being prey. And I sort of thought of the chapters as buckets in a way, because all of the research, which goes through different genres, there's memoir, there's folklore, there's anthropology and psychology, and I wanted to have a weave that was based around breaking down the binaries that we traditionally slot the wolf into, which are not fair.
So you mentioned, of course, a young female wolf, and I feel like we should talk about the specific wolf and the many, many facts, and that wolf is a bit of a celebrity.
Yeah. Did anyone out here hear about OR7 at the time? Some people, Newsweek called him the most famous wolf in the world, so that was true, maybe. But he was an Oregon wolf who left his family in September 2011, and left his pack in northeastern Oregon, the seventh wolf collared in Oregon, and quickly became the first wolf in western Oregon, and then the first wolf in California. And there were no wolves since settlers had exterminated them in the mid-20th century. And so OR7 came to sort of like represent a lot of the like reparative wilderness environmentalism movement in my mind. And I was sort of telling myself, well, I'm not watching OR7, I'm just watching people watch OR7. So I would like be in the Facebook groups and the Twitter accounts dedicated to him. And I would just be like, well, I'm just watching the other respondents. But his collar, he was wearing a radio collar, so it was beaming his location. So people were getting notifications every time he crossed into California. And there's one paper that was following him in Southern Oregon that called themselves the TMZ of the wildlife world. And their goal was basically trying to figure out if OR7 was going to find a mate. Well, not their goal, everyone's goal. OR7 left his pack looking for love, as the headline said. That's not a me quote, that's a headline quote. And at a certain point, he'd wandered like 1,000 miles and then eventually 4,000 miles, which is quite a superlative distance for a wolf to not get hit by a car or a poacher. This was an area of Oregon where there were no other wolves, and he was looking for another wolf where he was unlikely to find one. And I think that sort of hopelessness and also rooting, people love an underdog, and OR7 was an underdog until he found a lady wolf. And I was talking to a biologist who said he started getting calls from people saying, we thought you planted the wolf. Like, this rom-com is too good to be true. And the biologist was like, I wish we'd have thought of that. Like, obviously we don't have time to like go do that. But then OR7 settled down, and I think I started following OR7's path around the time I got interested in wolves, and then as they settled down in Oregon, and things just got a little bit more complicated. His family grew, and the headlines were literally like, OR7's a grandfather, he's bringing home the bacon. But, on a complex level, between 2016 and 2021, 40 depredations of livestock and a couple dogs were traced to their pack, not OR7 specifically, but his family. And so, to me, the popular story of OR7, and it is a popular story, there's children's books, documentaries, a lot of this, but it kind of ends in the way rom-coms end, at the meet cute, and or the pups. And I was interested in actually, this idea of actually living beside wolves is not just like rooting for them on some aesthetic plane, but thinking about, I met rancher and his son, his 10-year-old son who'd found one of their dogs who'd been attacked, and talking to this boy who was quite fascinated by the wolf and also sad about his dog. And that's just a reality of wolves sharing the landscape. Their habitat is our habitat, and so I wanted to follow OR7's life in a way that he's sort of like I think of him as kind of like a ladder, and also my own kind of chronology leaving home. And we kind of go into these other investigations into like werewolves or psychology or linguistics, but like you always come back to these two stories of OR7 and I kind of leaving our packs and finding our way.
And there's I love them. There's a map in the front of the book, and so you can kind of be like, where's Erica? Where's Erica? Where's the wolf? Where's the wolf?
That was a kind of corny move, but
we all know I'm corny. So I was into it.
No, thank you.
It was a little bit like, I don't know, it was the sort of move that we sometimes associate with almost like fantasy, as much as we associate with like, I don't know, science writing. And so I was like, oh, here we are in the Shire of Erica's imagination, which was so great. And you did, like OR7 kind of, right, you're breaking down some notions of like masculinity and fear in there, but the book starts with a female body, and in so many ways refers to kind of patriarchy. And I wonder if you could talk about that, because that description, the first description of a wolf in your book, she's gorgeous. She's just like, I was like, what a beautiful wolf. The tail is a paintbrush dipped in ink, and the writing is just beautiful, and the wolf is in turn beautiful. And you quote the South African fairy tale scholar Jessica Tiffin writes, wolves are trapped in folkloric narrative that defines them just as firmly as women, and like women, they are feared and reviled for their potentially predatory power. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about wolves and patriarchy, and what either of those things has to do with our ideas about like not only fear but also beauty. Because I think one of the things the book really helped me see was how gorgeous these animals are.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It does open with a scene of a wolf that's on the side of the road, and she was really beautiful, and the photo was pretty stunning because her eyes were open, and it was probably a situation where the poacher tried to make it look like she'd been hit by a car. And I was so struck when I saw it, I couldn't look away, and was really thinking about what it means to like, that the first line of the book is something like, this is one of those stories that begins with a female body. And I was interested in those narratives of fairy tales and true crime have a lot in common, right? They're both a version of how to go out into the world, and they kind of keep you on a path if you absorb it too deeply, I think. And I was interested in tracing, the wolf so often represents in kind of American culture. Someone was just telling me about someone that they'd once dated with like a crazy macho wolf tattoo. And I think that spirit of wolf with masculine power, I tried to trace how far did that go back. And what I found was that language, Prussian, Sanskrit, Iranian, the words for wolf and outlaw, or wolf and evildoer, or wolf and robber, they're there across many different cultures. And this idea of warriors, ancient warrior initiates dressing as wolves and really or the berserkers doing these battle things. They were allowed to act differently in battle if they were kind of embodying a wolf. And of course there's warrior traditions of wolves that are quite noble as well. But I think that I was uncomfortable with that conflation. And I think specifically Little Red Riding Hood was the story that I had no time for as a child. I was like, I just don't care. I want a story about a girl who's empowered. And the interesting thing in that story is that very often either Little Red Riding Hood dies or the wolf dies. There's no restorative justice. There's no, we're going to talk this out. It's just, you're dead or I'm dead. And that is the kind of clearest binary that was annoying to me. Annoying is like a mild word for how I felt. And so I think also rereading these early versions of Little Red Riding Hood in the University of Minnesota archive, shout out, there was a picture book that showed Little Red Riding Hood and the way she was created as being very foolish. And the idea that this is a story, Charles Dickens actually said, if I could have married Little Red Riding Hood, I would have had true love. Which is the creepiest thing he's ever said, maybe? Can I say that? And I think the idea that that is a story that is both creating a version of a wolf that is not realistic, right, is harmful to wolves, but also I didn't like what it said about women. And I think that sense of I'll just go in and be the woodcutter and I'm going to cut us both out of the story and ultimately realizing, like, well, some part of that story is useful, which is that sometimes there is fear that you have to live with. And I felt like very often the stories about wolves were stories about other things. So many of the idioms that came up in different cultures are really like parents trying to teach their young, like, how to survive, how to get by, how to live, and that idea that the wolf is the specter of that unfortunate thing I wanted to dismantle. I didn't talk about beauty at all, but I think I'm still thinking about that. I just love that idea. And I do think, like, I guess there's one thing there, which is the idea that fear sometimes, all wolves are born afraid, like young wolves are afraid. And that made me think about how we all have a certain amount of fear that we have to keep ourselves alive, but we also, that question of how to dose fear in ourselves are also questions that a young wolf is asking. And I was reading about the ways that wolves, like, their curiosity and their fear are intertwined. If, like, a wolf hears something in a bush, they're going to go over, and that's kind of beautiful. Like, that gets them exploring, and wolves are very exploratory. And so I did think a lot about how fear can be very bad, and it can make your world very small, but isn't some amount of intrigue or what if there's, like, maybe a beauty or there's a curiosity in that. And I was trying to dose that in myself as someone who loves to go hiking alone and does things sometimes. I tried to walk here from downtown, and I was like, it'll be fine, and it was so icy, and I had to admit that my fear had overpowered my sense of adventure, and I had to call someone. But I think that's maybe an example of the way that, like, fear and beauty are together.
I think the curiosity is kind of what I was getting at, because I do think, like, right, we're interested in things that we're afraid of, and we're interested in things that are beautiful, and so much of the writing here is, I mean, it's just so attentive to, I mean, I think the way that they move in the world, so I felt that I was seeing them very clearly. And, I mean, you're talking here about women, and of course, like, one of the things you do in the book is that you include yourself in it, which is, must have been a difficult thing to do in comparison to some of the other research. And as you know, I have many favorite sections of the book, but one of them is this section in which you and some of your comrades consume mandrake. And that's not safe, in case you didn't know. And so we know some of the end of the story because Eric is sitting here next to me. But, you know, there's this incident which is, like, quite suspenseful. And so, of course, you lived it, and then you investigated it. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about living that and then also processing it on the page.
I was so glad that you picked that section to talk about. I mean, I do think many of the moments that I talk about in the book are things that I would not say are really superlative experiences. And that became sort of important to me. Like, at some point I was getting feedback on the manuscript, and someone said, well, this is a pretty normal assault. And I was like, those two words together are worthy of a whole chapter, right? And I think that idea that these small splinter-like moments of fear that many of us carry and accumulate all day long, they can have a very sedimentary effect, and they can really shape us, right? So I think in the same way that I follow OR7, who's just like, he's a kind of extraordinary wolf, but he's also just doing these things and wandering around, and I'm also just wandering around. And there's these micro moments that you focus on in both of our lives that hopefully help you see a wolf and help you see someone who's trying to investigate how I metabolize fear. The Sicily incident is actually, like, just a really good dinner party story for a long time. Or I say that, like, I learned to distance myself from it in a way to make it, I accidentally ate mandrake, basically, with two colleagues when I was living in Italy at a cooking school. And mandrake's the Harry Potter screaming root thing, and the greens are very toxic. And, I mean, there will still be suspense when you read it, but essentially my colleague went into a coma, and I thought I'd killed him, and I was also hallucinating and hospitalized at the time. And I think it was so deeply upsetting to me, both because I was afraid I was going to die I spent one night thinking I'm going to die next, and also I knew that I had potentially killed someone. And I think that sense of my own sort of, like, foolishness, you know, Little Red Riding Hood is nothing if not just, like, ditzy in the forest. And I felt like that's what I'd done. I picked this thing that I thought was edible, and now somebody's dead. And so it was the psychological, like, burden of that night became huge, and I think I write about it. I didn't know how to write about it in this book, but I knew it had really deeply affected my experience of like having a body in the world and being afraid. And it wasn't until I started researching werewolf stories that I learned that some of the early narratives around werewolves are traced to this Mediterranean region of Sicily where I was, and actually stories of women who would dose themselves with this plant and have these sort of dream visions of violence or do these things. Like some early werewolf stories, there's a number of sort of explanations for what werewolves were, and mental illness or associated with being on drugs, with a number of things, but one was actually like, maybe you've ingested some literally mandrake and you're acting crazy. And it was helpful. Suddenly I was visualizing what had happened that night, and before my colleague went into a coma, his body did jerkily, he was acting in ways that a human doesn't act. And I also was living in a body that was not reacting in ways that I'd ever seen it react. And there was something about turning into something I didn't understand that suddenly it became like this way into the werewolf story where I felt a lot of like empathy for this idea that over the course of a night you can transform, and that's not maybe an evil thing. That's like, it's just a more complex thing than I'd ever thought about it.
Yeah, reading it, that section is so riveting, and although I, of course, knew some part of the end of the story, I was reading it from the safety of that knowledge, and the way that you convey that is, it's incredibly compelling, and then also, of course, the connections that you manage to find kind of in your own past as you're excavating are just, it's an incredibly rewarding read. I'm sure that there are questions in the audience, and so I might sneak one more in unless someone has a hand now. All right, I will ask one more, and then we will turn to you. I'm curious about whether your relationship with fear is different after finishing this book.
I don't think the therapist I had in Minneapolis is here. I had an early therapist here who heard that I was having trouble walking down the street after being grabbed, and I said I was writing about fear, and she said, I don't think you should do that. I think you're fixating. And that was wrong. I'm a less fearful person now after writing about it. Like, I do think there was a degree of having to think so deeply about the story. I mean, understanding that fear is a story that's sold to us, and it's always benefiting someone, and it's always, very often, I think Claudia Rankine has a quote about, we need, if we don't fear death, we don't need the state. And she's basically re-quoting Hegel. So, and I'm also misquoting her, obviously, but it's something like that. And I think that idea that fear is always like operating and it's being bought and sold and it's interacting on a lineage was helpful for me to like place myself in that and not have, I think part of it was I felt a lot of fear, but I didn't trust at all, like a gut instinct, if it's coming from a sort of body that's wired with like the prejudice of growing up in America, can you trust that gut instinct? No. And so what we need to like investigate these narratives about fear pretty deeply. And I think that I think now that like growing up is a process for many of us of learning to live beside the things that scare us, and learning to sort of fairy tales. To go back to the werewolf stories, so many werewolf stories from around the world that I found there would be talk about them in oral histories, and it would be saying like, this is a story that reads less like a folklore as an oral history of somebody saying like, I survived this thing. And very often in traditional societies that you maybe couldn't talk about a sexual assault or an abortion or a miscarriage, you could talk about seeing a werewolf. And there were examples of the Russian researcher who'd found that. And I think there's something extraordinary about the way that telling a story about fear can lessen it and can be a way of saying like, I survived and I'm the protagonist here. And so maybe there is a way that doing that through the book, I feel more, I don't know, I'm camping alone again now, which I wasn't at a time when I started it.
That's great. Questions from the audience?
Did you research that? Did you mention at all the person that like was wasn't there a human that was raised by wolves? And, I don't know, they discovered him when he was older.
Yeah, there's a number of sort of cases like this. Was it in India? There's Rudyard Kipling. It's very tied into colonialism, some of those stories. And I do reference, there was a couple cases in Azerbaijan where these young girls were sort of multiple times were found with wolves. So there's a couple of these cases that are really interesting.
Nothing in the United States, like
I
recently?
didn't, a recent United States one, I'd have to think about that. I don't write about it, I'm sorry to say. I can't give you a page number. But it is, I think that impulse of like the wolf as a mothering figure, my final chapter is wolf versus mother, but also looking a lot at mother wolves and what that archetype, because that's such a strong cultural archetype as well. So I was interested in that.
Good side.
Yeah. Yeah.
How has exploring fear in the new way that you have reconceptualized your understanding of yourself and relationship with others?
That's really beautiful. Yeah, so how has researching fear in the way that I have helped me reconceptualize my relationship with self and others? I think one thing that I'm thinking about is I called up a biologist who studies the ecology of fear, which is a field I didn't know about, and this idea that all animals are moving through a sort of psychological topography where you're recognizing threat or safety at various moments. Drinking water is dangerous because my head is down, right? And that idea that all animals are, like I was just talking to her and she said, well, Erica, when something stressful happens, if you're a plant, an animal, a person, your body's different the next day. Like you're a changed being. And she said, fear is not an emotion in my lab. It's like a set of behavioral responses. And I really like that idea. It became easier to see that. I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is both wolves and people, you can both fear and fear for. And I think understanding that like predator and prey are not designations, but they're sort of, I describe it as like a cloud passing over the sun. Like you're predator, then you're prey, right? And I heard another story from a biologist of he was following a wolf and he one day found it in a field surrounded by blood. And it had this like stab wound here. He was trying to figure out what happened with it, and an elk they'd been tussling, and the elk's antlers had skewered the wolf, and it had spun it around, and there was like a circle of blood, and the wolf was lying there, and the elk had left. And so he said to me, his punchline was, you got to give the prey more credit. The prey are pretty badass. And is the elk the predator then? Like, I don't know. Those are rusty terms. But I think that understanding of like growing up, Maggie Nelson has a quote about women sometimes feel like you're born dead. If you grow up in a certain fairy tale true crime world and you're like growing up is waiting for bad things to happen to you, and that felt like a really like lousy way to grow up into the world. And this idea that you're predator and prey and you're all of these things and like on an ecological web was much more satisfying. So that's a lot of thoughts toward that general question. There's another hand over here, I think. Oh, Anna, hi.
Well, first, Erica, thank you so much for that beautiful reading, and also this conversation has been amazing. I know that you're somebody who cares so much about research and conversation, and I'm wondering if there's a particular moment of research or a particular interview or conversation that you had that was kind of like either your favorite or least favorite like thing that happened during this project.
That's so good. I think one thing that I love being surprised by people, which happens all the time, and I was actually at the house of this rancher who'd had the first livestock kills from Oris Evans' pack, and his son was the one who'd found the dogs, and I was he knew I was writing a book about wolves, and I was a bit worried that there would be some antagonism potentially there. And one of the first things he said, he had a Ranch magazine and the New Yorker both sitting on his table. And he said, well, I got to read what you guys are reading. Got to see what you're all about. And he was just a funny guy. And we were sitting with a cup of coffee. And he's like, well, do you want to come see my wolf? And he took me into his study. And he had a wolf pelt that was a full thing. And I was worried that he'd killed a wolf and was showing me his poach thing. And he said, this was my pet. Her name's Otter. She looked like an otter when she was wet. She was so sweet. And in the 70s, he'd had a pet wolf because he was a scientist. He was a biology teacher. And it was more normal in the 70s to have wolves. So I let him off the hook for that. But he had the wolf because he loved wolves and he marveled at them. And I think like that duality of someone who was trying to help his son cope about his dog being eaten by a wolf. And also he was like, this wolf is so beautiful, and just wanted to tell me stories of like going out with this wolf. And I don't think people should have captive wolves, but there was a sense of awe and grief that were intertwined in a way that I think was so extraordinary, when so many of the narratives I've heard were like, ranchers hate wolves, and there's just this binary, and actually people are so much more complex.
You skinned it.
Yeah, I didn't want to know how the sausage got made there. Yeah.
Did you, especially since you did graduate school here, northern Minnesota has a different experience with wolves and the focus on wolves, and possibly a little bit more romanticized still because we don't have ranchers up north.
Yeah.
Did you find any overlap between, say, an Oregon, Montana perspective and here?
That's really interesting, because I do think there's constantly this like looking over one shoulder at what the other is doing, right? Or seeing this place as far behind. I didn't, despite being here, I didn't do wolf research in the sort of Northwoods area, so I don't know that I can speak to it directly, but I will say that in England and Scotland, where I was doing some research, it's also there. Reintroduction is kind of out of the question in England, and yet because there's just not enough room and roads, was how the sort of conservationists I talked to put it, but there was a real sense of thrill of the wolf, and statistically, where they're not there, people like them more. But also, I think it was regions in Spain and Italy where wolves never left, people are less afraid of them. In England, they're more afraid of them. And so I think that idea of, I don't know what the polling school children about their fear of wolves in, say, Minnesota and Montana would be interesting, because the familiarity. I mean, I was talking to one rancher, and we were looking at her wildlife cameras that track wildlife, and there was like one wolf had walked down, and she was like, that's what I'm afraid of when I'm walking my dog alone. And then the next image was a pride of mountain lions, like 6 of them. And she was, as we were talking, she was like, you know what, I should probably be more afraid of that. I'm not even going to say anything. So yeah, like those constant like evaluations, I don't know what do you have in northern Minnesota? Anyway.
A quick follow-up for your sequel,
Bears, bearish, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
My question is actually, so in Minnesota, because you bring up Minnesota wolves,
Yeah.
And I love this really nuanced and complicated and complex way that you're kind of enriching this and taking us out of this binary and taking us out of, I think it's used as a wedge issue for so many things.
Yeah.
But literally yesterday in Minnesota, in the House and the Senate, State House, bills were introduced asking that if wolves lose their federal protection again, we not have a hunt be an option here in Minnesota. And as people know, in Wisconsin, a third of the wolves were killed last year with a hunt. In Montana, they're being killed. In last year, someone put in a bill that said, if wolves in Minnesota lose their protections, they will immediately be hunted, which was voted down. But so I'm sorry to kind of come into this conversation, but encourage people, if you want to look at the Howling for Wolves website and write to your reps and say, I really hope you will support these bills that literally went out yesterday. And there's a real push to compensate ranchers and farmers, because even if it is a very small amount of depredation, if you're the person losing 40 animals, that's gigantic, you know.
Yeah.
And that compensation doesn't bring your dogs back for your kid, but trying to find those ways to really promote.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I should mention this, even mentioning the depredations, like statistically, that's such a low percentage of the livestock that are killed. And so that idea, people are more likely to be killed by toddlers with guns, falling vending machines, autoerotic asphyxiation. More people die from all of those things than from wolves, right? By such a large number. But also, even livestock and dogs are not very likely, right? And so those.
And they're more likely to be killed when they're recreational hunts.
Yeah.
Because it fractures families, and so then they're more likely to depredate. So, it's kind of a win-win to not hunt them for fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
I won't talk about if people are losing livestock, that might be a different thing, but, so thank you for letting me put that plug out there.
Thank you.
It's really magical hearing about the way that you've woven together all these disparate pieces and the way that you read. And I was curious, like, after you were doing all this massive research, how you sat down and then you began writing. And we've touched on this a little bit, but how did you think about structure and making all these pieces come together in a cohesive whole?
have to like go back to parts of my brain that I have blacked out because it was so painful trying to figure that out. I think one thing that my agent said early on, which was very smart, was understanding that my experience was a tool of authority in the same way that an interview with an expert might be. And she sort of said maybe each chapter opens with a moment where I'm sort of feeling like predator, feeling like prey, reevaluating my relationship with fear, and then I thought, okay, well, I don't want to just have my body in this, I also want to have a wolf. And to write about OR7 from a sort of GoPro-like perspective sometimes, trying to imagine what it's like to be him. So I thought, I drew this crazy outline that had one column, which was like my lived experience that I was gonna, and I decided it would be sort of chronological. And then I had where the wolf was at that time. Like you mentioned, like wolf, there was a map, a very serial killer chart of where we each were at those times. And then understanding that I wanted readers to learn about wolf biology in some way in that chapter. And so it would sometimes, one review said sometimes I was using OR7 as a metaphor. And I thought that was interesting because sometimes I look at a wolf, for example, I learned that he had gone near wildfires to hunt for prey that were fleeing. And that was sort of poetic to me. And also that was an amazing biology fact that I didn't know wolves did. And I wanted it to be able to be both, like both the wolf fact and also the fact of me looking at that and thinking, when have I gone towards danger? Because it feels like what you have to do to stay alive, for example. And so often in that case, I would there would be these associations that would clang together when I would be looking at the wolf and thinking about my experience, and then sort of research would come into that. So I ended up thinking about The Boy Who Cried Wolf and thinking, when have experiences that I haven't similar to that, and when have people maybe told stories about wolves that were false, and then let's study Aesop's fables, because why stop? I'm just going to go down this omnivorous rabbit hole. And then it was sort of carving it away with a scalpel. But I think the first section was a really just like omnivorously gathering all the material and trying to like see where to stitch it. Thanks for that question.
Have you ever encountered a book called Wolf Totem, which is about the
Chinese
displacement of wolves in Inner Mongolia when the Han Chinese started settling? I found that book absolutely fascinating.
I do write about that one a little bit
Do you? I glanced at the notes. I didn't see it.
Yeah. Oh, I hope it's in there. You're my fact checker. That.
Impressive notes.
Yeah, that was an amazing story because it was also about real wolves. I think it was one of the best-selling novels in China. That is about real wolves on the Mongolian steppe, but also using the wolves kind of as a metaphor to talk about. And so I think, yeah, that's a rich tradition. Thank you. Yeah. We have
Maybe
time
one
for
more?
one more. Yeah.
So you talk about the different archetypes that you discovered. What was like your favorite and or most surprising as you got into research?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I think the mother wolf archetype was really interesting because I think a lot about archetypes of mothers in general. I don't have children, but I'm curious in them, and I think there was this story that I came across that then sort of shed light, which was there was a wolf pack and a coyote pack in Yellowstone that were sharing territory, and it was really fraught, and there were these coyotes that would basically, as the wolf mother was like bringing the food to her pups, the coyotes would sort of like bandit coyote attack the wolves and force them to regurgitate the food, and they would take it to their coyote pups. And what the mother wolf ended up doing in this real show of what does it mean to be a mother, she at one point she'd had enough after a couple weeks or months, I forget the time, and she goes over to the coyote den, and she's got her whole pack behind her, and all the coyotes are standing there just watching, and she goes up to the mother coyote and takes the coyote pups and eats them one by one. And it was so the researcher who saw this happen, he said it was the only time he'd ever heard of wolves predating on coyotes like that. Like, it just doesn't, don't think of it as happening. And at the same time, wolves have personalities, right? Like this wolf, can a wolf have vengeance and do that sort of thing? I mean, it became impossible for me to write about this without thinking about sort of what it said about what mothers are capable of and what the expectations are. And again, this is not me making any statement about human mothers, but I think understanding, I sort of was circling that archetype of the ferocity and vulnerability that a wolf mothers, and I sort of interpret mother in the book quite loosely. It's not tied to biology or gender. It's just sort of this idea of a caretaker. And that idea of like ferocity and vulnerability being really intertwined was really interesting to me.
Erica, thank you so much for your beautiful book and this fabulous conversation. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. Erica will be signing books over there at the signing table. You can pick up your copy, have her inscribe it to you. Erica, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susie.